understanding, by the way, everywhere in Europe and in the United States, that Ukraine would be taken in a week or in a month. No one was expecting Ukraine to fight. And it's only because Ukrainians have started to fight for their freedom, the West started to help them. Because, uh, the historical lessons of the Second World War are well known, right? And Poles knows it very well. No one helped Poland in September of 39, and it was taken quickly, but it did not stop the war, right? It just provoked Hitler to advance further and further and further. So when Ukrainians started to fight, then countries like Poland and the Baltic states, who were under, the Baltic states were under Soviet rule, and Poland, of course, had terrible history lessons with Russian occupation. They pressed the NATO countries to start to assist Ukraine very quickly, arguing that otherwise this war would escalate into European war. And they were right. So for 2.5 years, we are holding this barrier. But unfortunately, again, this just provokes Russia to conduct more and more, military operations and attack, and they're not planning to stop. Now, Putin, unfortunately, he's lieutenant colonel of the FSB. I mean, he's not even in general, right? His education stopped at one point. He's an experienced politician, a leader now, that's true. But all he remembers that in 1945, Americans used nuclear weapons, won the war against Japan, and became a superpower. All he remembers that in 1962, Khrushchev, agreed to take nuclear weapons from Cuba back to the Soviet Union and lost the chance to win the war against the United States. So I'm afraid that for him, this myth or this legend about the importance of nuclear weapons, which prevented 2 times Russia to become a dominant power, is very important. I'm afraid he might believe that in order to win the war, in order to establish itself as a great power, you would have at one point to use nuclear weapons. And yes, this is the real danger. This is the danger as long as Putin is in power. And that's why it's important to take him down, to change the regime. But once again, as a way to do it, the safest way to do it, let's put it this way, is to allow Ukraine to win. Otherwise, yes, we would have, use NATO ground forces, as Macron was suggesting, and otherwise the war will escalate.
What would you say, Yuri, is the biggest single threat to Vladimir Putin at the moment?
Ukraine, the only one. The only one. There is no domestic opposition. We have to face the reality. There are no opponents. All opponents are killed on preventive level, and it's not by chance that he killed people like Boris Nemtsov or Alexei Navalny. They killing leaders on preventive level, and there is no domestic opposition. We do not see it. I mean, we see some people, some brave people who go to prison for their political views, but the amount of those people is not critical for Putin regime. Everything is controlled quite well by the FSB. The only people who have, weapons in their hands in Russia is the FSB and the Minister of Defense, the army, and those people are loyal. There is no way to take down Putin peacefully. There are no people within the Russian government who are opposing him. So the only way to take him through the victory of war in Ukraine.
Could his position be undermined very quickly, though? I mean, if, for instance, Ukraine was allowed to strike targets in, for example, Moscow, deeper into mainland Russia, could you then see internal opposition to Putin rear its head? I mean, the nature with all these dictators is that, if they're going to rule by terror, they've got to rule by absolute terror. The moment their authority starts to appear shaky, it can go downhill very quickly.
I think the answer is yes, although I do not want to say that it's very simple and it's not going to be very quick. But again, we know from history that the attempt to kill Hitler, was the result of Germany not being able to conduct the war the way German army was expecting, right, in 1944, sorry. So there are some people who are able to deal with Putin, meaning the FSB, for example. But in order to do this, they have to have a good reason to do this. And if they would have a good reason to do this, they would do it in order to survive. But we even need to help them, right? Because so far, everything was normal for them. Again, Russia didn't feel this war at all. After these recent statements, and again, the statements came from approximately the same time from the United States, from France, from Germany. Uh, Actually, if you see what's happening now in Russia, they're in a stage of panic. I mean, because now they know that they're going to lose this war. They were they were winning this war slowly, but they were winning this war for 2.5 years, well, slightly less. But now they know that they are going to lose. That's why they started, to threaten the world with nuclear strikes, and it's happening, from all levels of the Russian governments. You have dozens of publications of the Russian officials claiming that, well, now we will have to use nuclear weapons. Now we will destroy you because you crossed the red line. Yes, we crossed the red line because for the first time in two and a half almost years of war, right? We changed the strategy, and now it's a strategy to win the war. Except, prior to this, it was a strategy that Russia is not losing and Ukraine is not winning.
That is fascinating. So, just to finish off by almost going back to where we started, you really do think, Yuri, that what we saw last week, that change in position, in particular from the Americans over US weapons being used by Ukraine against Russia inside Russia, you think that could be a game-changing moment in this war?
100%. Except that we have to continue to help Ukraine because we do remember that for 5 months the American help, for example, to Ukraine was frozen, and this was a major deal for Ukraine. That's why we have all these problems around Kharkov now. And yes, we have to continue to help Ukraine with weapons, with long-range weapons. We have to take down all limitations, including the limitation, if it still exists, I do not know, to strike against Moscow.
If you were Putin, you'd know that Zelensky is suffering from a temporary, hopefully, shortage of weapons and is having to be quite frugal with the use of weapons. If you were a military man, you'd be going, right, this is an opportunity to capitalize. I don't care what the human cost is. Just throw the bodies at the front line because ultimately will break through and make a strategic breakthrough. And therefore, it's quite possible that for the next couple of months, Russia will be taking that sort of tactical approach to this conflict. And it's quite possible they'll pay a huge price on the battlefield for it.
That's really interesting. When you say they might pay a huge price on the battlefield, you mean in terms of the casualties? So these casualty rates may continue, this kind of meat grinder tactics, that's going to continue?
Almost certainly, because we're not seeing the Russians do anything really different tactically on the battlefield. But ultimately, quantity sometimes has a quality all of its own. That the more people you throw at this, the more you wear down the Ukrainian defences. And eventually, a bit like pressure on a dam, you can only put your fingers in so many of the holes, and eventually the thing breaks through. And that's what Russia will be hoping, that they can apply enough pressure, throw enough bodies into the fight, I think what is interesting is the Institute of Studies of War and a lot of other military analysts believe that Russia hasn't actually got the resources to capitalize on a breakthrough. What do I mean by that? Is that it's not just manpower. When the floodgates open, you want to pour through and capitalize. But to do that, you need tanks, you need lots of other battlefield equipment. And you only have to look at the number of tanks that Russia has lost, which they don't dispute. They're bringing their old Second World War tanks out of storage to throw at the battlefield. They are struggling for equipment. So even if they do make a breakthrough, most military analysts don't think that they're going to make a strategic breakthrough. In other words, start taking significantly more chunks of Ukrainian land. But that then calls into, what do we think Putin's new objective is? His objective initially was to take Ukraine, 3 days, probably maximum. We're now here at 800 days, over 800 days into the campaign. I think Russia originally at its peak had 17% of the territory of Ukraine. I understand now it's down to 11%. So notwithstanding the tactical here or there, toings and froings, Russia is struggling on the battlefield. It's trying to capitalize on this shortage of weapons and will probably pay a big price for that.
And of course, in the last week, we've had the major developments of the US finally agreeing that American-supplied weapons can be used by Ukraine to strike targets inside Russia. How significant do you think that will be in the wider context of this war, Sean?
Yeah, there's been a lot made of this, hasn't there, James? Let's be clear about what's been offered and what hasn't been offered, because if I took your statement literally, I might imagine your viewers, listeners might imagine that's a carte blanche. It's not. America has been very careful to say that given the opening of a second front or potential second front around Kharkiv by the Russians, that the US recognises that Ukraine will need to use weapons outside of Ukrainian territory, but it has been very clear it's in the defence of Kharkiv, so it hasn't given carte blanche. Secondly, it said they must be targeting military targets, not civilian. And thirdly, my understanding is that they've not included ATACMS, that army tactical missile system, in that caveat, which is about 300-kilometre range. So, but in a way, even though there are caveats, I'm a great believer you can't be a little bit pregnant. You either do allow that stuff to target or not. And America now has said they can. And they joined sort of UK, the French, the Poles and the Germans, all of which have taken the shackles off the ability to use these weapons deeper within Russian territory. And I think that will be pretty significant. Let's give you an example. When this second front around Kharkiv opened up, for several months, Ukraine has known that Russia has been massing troops, between 30 and 50,000 troops in the area, but it couldn't do anything about it. And it had to wait until they came across the border. If they had had the weapons to attack those, they would have undoubtedly caused a lot of difficulty for Russia. You can't easily mass 50,000 people and keep them hidden. Because it's not just about the people, it's the vehicles, it's the weapons, it's the food, it's the logistics. They come with a huge tail. So able to target those will be really, really useful for the Ukrainians. But I do think it's another step, I think. What's lovely about this is that when Russia first invaded, the West didn't want to get involved. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. We're not going to get involved. Gradually, Ukraine did an amazing job of withstanding the first push. And all of a sudden, the West went, actually, Ukraine's got a chance here. If we help them, so we provided anti-tank weapons. Russia made a big fuss about it. We did it, and it made a big difference. Then there was talk about providing tanks. Russia threw its arms up in the air. The West prevaricated, was really concerned about what might lead to escalation. The Brits gave Challenger 2, then Leopard 2s, then Abrams were involved. Then we went through long-range missiles, and suddenly everybody went through this same cycle of worry again. And eventually Storm Shadows were provided and scalped the French equivalent. Not yet the German Taurus, but maybe in time. So I do think this is just yet another example of a stiffening political resolve that President Putin shouldn't have it all his own way. This isn't about NATO getting involved. NATO getting involved would be troops on the ground fighting. This is simply a question of going, right, Ukraine needs help. What can we do to help?
Well, it does beg the question, to what extent the Kremlin is bluffing. I mean, the Kremlin has responded to the decision last week to allow American-supplied weapons to be used by Ukraine inside Russia by accusing NATO of provoking a new level of tension. The fear has always been that an escalation may, in the worst-case scenario, end up with Putin using tactical nuclear weapons. Do you think that's a realistic risk, Sean?
Well, James, this is always an interesting question because I'm going to play my grey hair old card here against you youngsters. When I joined the military, we were in the middle of the Cold War. We were living with the omnipresent threat of nuclear war. And the whole concept at the time was called mutually assured destruction, MAD, because nobody would press the button. The whole success of nuclear weapons is that the Armageddon that follows is simply the ultimate deterrence against somebody attacking you. So we've lived through all these threats. President Putin today knows that his unprovoked invasion of Ukraine would be halted in a heartbeat if NATO was to get involved, if NATO warplanes were to go in and provide air cover, if NATO military capability was to be deployed. So in his head, he has to do everything possible to deter that happening. And by rattling the nuclear saber, which he's done consistently throughout this war, he has effectively scared Western politicians into being fearful of getting involved. He's even gone as far as forward deploying nuclear weapons to Belarus, if you remember, last year, finished off earlier this year. But actually, there's no military gain from forward deploying nuclear weapons. They can go around the world. This is purely a bit of bluster to try to sow seeds of doubt in the Western political mind, and it has worked. But the harsh reality is that it doesn't suit Putin to get NATO involved. It doesn't suit Putin to have any form of nuclear war at all. He's just using it as saber rattling, and it's proving very effective. But I referred back, James, to I've just come away from a really interesting conference, closed door, Chatham House, can't talk about the detail. But what was fascinating was that in principle, the Western leaders are unanimous of the view that whatever happens, if Russia was to succeed in using military force to redraw the boundaries of Russia, where would that stop? If in the modern world, any nation was able to use force to redraw boundaries, then it would be the end of the world order as we currently know it. And therefore, that cannot be allowed to prevail. Now, we focus, your chat to me is more focused about the military angle of that. But obviously, there are three pillars to this. One is military, one is political, and one is economic. And what is fascinating is just seeing how those other lines are being developed at the moment to try to put increasing pressure on Russia, not just on Putin, because bluntly, whilst Putin is the front of house, the real power history shows is with the oligarchs, with the generals and stuff like that. And if they generally see their quality of life imploding, there's normally a correction of some form, and Russia self-corrects itself. And I think what the West has decided is that, yes, military is important, but also politically, Russia wants to be great again. Their leader's been indicted by the International Criminal Court, and there are other things that can be done against the wider body of Russian support in the war. And the economic one is that, at the moment, Russia's spending 40% of its, spending on defense. That's just not sustainable. I mean, all of the other things that you would be spending money on as a government, loads of them aren't being spent. People are hemorrhaging away from the country. It's not investing in the long term. And Russia had, I think it was about 700 billion of reserves. That's down at about 200 billion now. And some of that has been locked away, frozen by the West. And then remember, there's been this discussion about, we can't take that money off Putin. That will be illegal. It does look likely now. They've decided it will be illegal to take the money off him, but the interest it's earning is not illegal. So actually, if we were to seize that 200 billion, and if we were to lock it into a bond and let the money come out in 40 years' time, then the interest is worth money, and you could give that lump sum in advance to Ukraine. And so there's all sorts of different ways, I think, that the West is going to apply pressure across these three lines, but you must make sure the military one doesn't fail. But it doesn't mean that you have to win on the battlefield in order to achieve the long-term strategic objectives for Ukraine.
And so for 10 years, Russia has been trying to overrun Ukraine, and they haven't done it yet. And so I think there's a certain amount of frustration in what we see and what Russia is doing with its troops. It's throwing manpower away. We hear from very reputable sources from multiple directions. They're losing as many as 1,000 plus a day in Ukraine right now. That is an indication of desperation in my mind. So now, Mr. Putin, one of the advantages he's had in this war is that the West has forbidden Ukraine from firing into Russia, and the West has allowed Russia to fire at will into Ukraine from all around the map on the ground. And so what is happening now is the West is beginning to allow Ukraine to fire back. I think that adds to the desperation that Russia is facing in this war right now. And so what is the weapon that is working the very best for Putin in this war? It's his war of words, his war of intimidation. We told him 10 years ago what we in the West were afraid of. We're afraid of nuclear, and we're afraid of widening the war. So what has Mr. Putin played back to the West for 10 years, but certainly in the last 2 years? He nearly every week makes some sort of a change or a threat in nuclear business. And nearly every week he mentions that he's going to do something like this, which is give long-range weapons to other people to fire at the West. So Mr. Putin is counting on his best weapon, which is intimidation. We in the West are severely deterred by Mr. Putin's intimidation. He has caused many in the West to take counsel of their fears and make policy based on their fears rather than what needs to be done. And so this, I think, is just one more step. He's desperate. He sees now that Ukraine is going to be able to take the war to Russia on their own soil. And now he's got to find a new step in the intimidation game to get the West to back down, to get Western leaders to take counsels of their fear again and make changes in policy.
And yeah, his message is also, you could argue, contradictory, because he also has said, almost in the same breath, that he's dismissed the idea that Russia wants war with NATO.
So this is a tricky answer because it's going to appear that I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. I really don't think that Mr. Putin wants a war with NATO. Excuse me. I think he realizes right now his army has done so poorly against Ukraine that it would be absolutely no match on the battlefield for a determined NATO. I think Mr. Putin knows that. But what Mr. Putin wants to do, again, through his intimidation regime, is to snip at and bite at and grab certain things to show to not only his internal audience, but the world that he understands that he has the rest of the world intimidated, and he's going to use that advantage to continue pressing forward. I mean, if you really, having just returned from multiple trips overseas, what is clear to me is that Russia's gray zone war in Georgia is wreaking havoc on the people of Georgia and the government of Georgia. I spent time recently with two of the top three leaders of Moldova. And what Russia is doing in Moldova is bordering on kinetic now, bordering on breaking out of gray zone. So Mr. Putin is incredibly active. Now he's trying to redraw water space in the northern seas. He's recently, we're going to start hearing about it in the news, tried to orchestrate a murder in the United States. And so Mr. Putin is active out there all around the world, and he's counting on this nuclear intimidation to back down Western leaders because it's been very successful so far.
Could you tell me a bit more about what you learnt on your travels then about Russia's grey zone activities?
So I think that I don't want to overcharacterize, and I won't speak for any one nation directly, but having talked to leaders and two of the national leaders of some of these nations, it is clear to me that the Western nations are beginning, and that includes some of the larger Western nations, are beginning to tire of these incessant, freewheeling Russian operations in their countries. We're starting to recognize what they are doing in our cyberspaces, what they're doing with money, moving money around, what they're doing orchestrating deaths in foreign nations. This is beginning to now raise the ire of leaders to the point of taking some sort of action. And how that will play out, maybe that will be a conversation at the Washington summit coming up soon.
What kind of action are you talking about that's being considered?
I can't speak for NATO. I can't speak for those people anymore. I would tell you that there are folks in these nations that are going to start taking more concrete action. People are starting to talk about seizing, using Russian money and taking those actions where they can make the pain increase for Mr. Putin.
Interesting about what you're talking about, the awareness of grey zone activity, and something that did hit the news recently is Russia having been condemned by EU leaders for this provocative behaviour after border guards removed around 20 boys along the Narva River used to demarcate the Estonian-Russian border, being seen as part of this broader pattern of hybrid actions by Russia on its maritime and land borders in the Baltic region. I mean, is that how you see it? And what do you think Russia is trying to do with it?
Well, I think this is exactly what Russia's trying to say. First of all, Mr. Putin is having a bigger problem internally. He has to show some progress. He has to show some success. He has to show that he's standing up to the West. He has to continue to lie to and convince his people that the West is trying to attack Russia and that the United States is the great engine of the West in trying to attack Russia. And so these nibblings, like I said before, these little nibblings around the edges, the sea spaces in the north, the border with Narva, all of these things are ways that Putin is trying to show his people that he is strong, he's standing up to the West, and the West is the great enemy. And I think that we in the West have decisions to make. If we allow Mr. Putin to do these things in the northern seas, redraw the lines, pull up the water buoys, he allows these things to happen. If we allow these things to happen on the border, then Mr. Putin will continue to push. I was reminded by one of the national leaders on this trip. He told me the story that Lenin apparently said that when you face your enemy, you fix your bayonet and you push your bayonet into his belly. And if his belly is soft, you keep pushing. If the belly is hard, then you pull back and reconsider your options. And so Mr. Putin is pushing his bayonet into our belly, all around the edges of NATO. And he will continue to push where we're soft. And he will stop pushing where he meets hard resistance. The question is, are we ready? Are our leaders ready to make the tough decisions to present a hard belly rather than a soft belly?
And in that particular instance, on the border area, the water border area between Russia and Estonia, I mean, the response really so far has been kind of, come and explain yourself, Russia. I mean, it's not exactly what you'd expect if to show a sort of a tough stance on that. What do you think the correct response should be?
Well, I learned very quickly as the SACUR, I couldn't tell any one nation what to do. Estonia will make some decisions on its own, and that's a great country, and they get it. But again, Russia's going to push until they hit something hard. And so when are we going to take those steps to tell Mr. Putin no more?
It's well known that this is not a healthy population, and you have a hard time finding too many Russians that actually want to join the army and come into Ukraine. They know what happens. Now, the Russians also know, the Kremlin knows that this is not sustainable. That's why they have avoided recruiting heavily from Moscow and St. Petersburg, because they don't want a bunch of funerals happening in those cities. Instead, the funerals tend to happen out in the poorer regions of the Russian Federation, central and eastern Russia, where people are willing to take the bonus of money if they join the military. And the Kremlin doesn't care about those casualties. But I don't think that they can maintain their industry and an army of the size that they need, given the casualties they're suffering.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're once again talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. General Hodges served for 38 years in the US Army, commanding in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was Commander US Army Europe from 2014 to 2017. We always appreciate your time on Frontline, General. Welcome back.
Well, James, thanks, and I always appreciate the privilege of being on your program.
I wanted to start by putting to you something we were discussing on yesterday's episode of Frontline. I was talking to the historian, Dr. Yuri Felshtinsky, and he said, in his view, last week's decision by the US to allow American-supplied weapons to strike targets inside Russia could be a turning point in this war. Do you agree?
Well, turning point is a pretty strong word, especially when you consider how limited the actual policy decision is. It still prohibits the use of the 300-kilometer ATACMS for use at legitimate targets inside Russia, and it also limits this new policy to the area that is linked to Kharkiv. So, I don't see that as quite such a turning point. It's good news, obviously, and the Ukrainians didn't waste any time in hitting targets, air defense weapons, logistics, etc., on the Russian side of the border. And, surprise, surprise, Russia did not retaliate with nuclear weapons. So, we just continue to deter ourselves because of an excessive fear that Russia might do something about it. I think this hesitancy and indecision and incremental decision making is a reflection of the fact that we have not committed to helping Ukraine win. We still don't have a clearly defined end state for this war, and it's difficult to have good policy if you don't have a clearly defined end state.
Why is that, do you think? Because, repeatedly since the start of this conflict, since the full-scale invasion, time and again, we've seen Ukraine requesting certain pieces of military support and initially being met with resistance, whether it's anti-tank missiles or main battle tanks or the ATACMS, or now being able to use Western weapons inside Russia. And resistance at first to giving way eventually. Had we been more proactive, as in fairness to you, generally, you've been calling for all along, surely we'd be in a very different situation.
I think it'd be a completely different situation. I mean, think about Russia's inability to exploit the 6-month window in which no U.S. aid was forthcoming and Europe did not step up to fill that gap. So almost half a year, and Russia was not able to really exploit that in any meaningful way. They've barely moved beyond Avdiivka or Bakhmut, and they're not going to be able to capture Kharkiv or overrun the Ukrainian defenses around there. Now, to be clear, it's hell for civilians that live in Kharkiv, and it's very difficult for Ukrainian troops that are getting pounded by Russian artillery. But the fact is, Russia does not have the ability to overrun or knock out Ukraine. And so if we had been providing everything that was needed for Ukraine to win versus providing them just enough to keep them in the fight, I think we would see significant losses, even more significant losses of Russian military capability. SACEUR, General Cavoli said, you can defeat mass, which is Russia's only advantage. You can defeat mass with precision by going after headquarters, logistics, and artillery. And we did not provide that to the Ukrainians as we should have.
Well, that does beg the question what more we should be doing at the moment. How much more proactive should the West and Ukraine's allies be? Should we be looking at a no-fly zone, for instance? Should we be looking at troops, NATO troops on the ground, as Macron has sort of suggested at times? What more do you think we should be doing, General?
Well, at the risk of sounding like a scratch record, the first thing we've got to do is determine what is our desired outstate or outcome. What is the strategic objective for what we're doing? Obviously, it should be help Ukraine defeat Russia, because it is in the strategic interests of the United States, of the UK, of everybody in Europe that Russia is defeated, forced back to its own borders, the 1991 sovereign borders of Ukraine, to force Russia to live within their own borders, to defeat them in Ukraine. It's in our interest that that happens for economic reasons, for security reasons, and also for the reason of values. What we claim we value so much, the international rules-based order, respect for sovereignty, respect for freedom of navigation, respect for human rights, respect for international law. That's what's at stake here. And of course, the Chinese are watching to see if we really are serious about those things. So the first thing that should happen would be my president, the German Bundeskanzler, your prime minister, President Macron, and others say it is our strategic objective that Ukraine defeats Russia, wins the war. If you did that, first of all, that would open the gates then for providing everything that's needed. Secondly, that would tell the Kremlin that their only hope was that we were going to quit has been dashed, and that they are the ones that should desperately be trying to salvage what they can. If we've done that, now we start talking about practical implementation. Policy decisions like establishing a no-fly zone, that is a policy decision. But to do a no-fly zone, this is not like Star Trek, where big giant deflector shields come up, but where you have to put Royal Air Force, U.S. Air Force, German Luftwaffe pilots up in the air, and that are prepared to destroy Russian air defense systems that may even be inside Russia. You cannot have a no-fly zone if the enemy is able to shoot down your aircraft. And you also have to be prepared to go in and pick up pilots that have been shot down that may have parachuted to the ground inside Russia. These are important considerations for a policy of no-fly zone. Now, you could also, of course, think about putting U.S. or British or French air defense systems with American, British, or French crews inside Ukraine to augment what they already have. But you just need to be aware that there's a very good chance that some of them are going to be destroyed because the Russians will come after them. So I'm not against having American troops on the ground there, but if I was the chief of the U.S. Army and I was told, get ready to deploy your men and women into Ukraine, I'd say, great, we'll be ready. But for what purpose? What is the objective? Why are we doing this? What are we hoping to accomplish? It's too easy for our political leaders to throw troops at a problem, to throw airplanes at a problem without ever thinking through to the end state. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan and only had a clear objective in the first year. And then after that, we had different policies, and it all ended in a catastrophe because we lost sight of the original reason for being there.
Which I suppose begs the question, General, how do you define Ukraine winning this war? Is it reclaiming all the territory that Russia has occupied since 2022? Is it reclaiming the territory that Russia has occupied since 2014? What should we consider Ukraine and Ukraine's victory to be?
Well, James, that's the easiest question you've asked me. President Zelensky has said it's restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty, which means the 1991 borders. I completely agree with that. That should be our objective. Otherwise, if we only push back to the 2022 border, that means that Russian aggression that started in 2014 that led to the illegal annexation of Crimea and the support of the so-called separatists in the Donbass, that they would be rewarded for that.
What did you think of Dmitry Medvedev? Because you met him, didn't you, on several occasions?
Yeah, I did meet him. He was at the NATO summit in Lisbon, which is probably the most positive summit we had with the Russians in a very long time. Certainly, the last time we had a positive one with them in 2012, the Russians didn't show up. Putin was already president at that time. Again, president, as I said, and I met him in Sochi. The North Atlantic Council traveled to Sochi and met with him at the presidential dacha there. He seemed to be genuinely interested in the cooperative relationship and trying to figure out ways in which we could move forward. I met with Foreign Minister Lavrov many times, and we had the relationship in which we had a list of grievances and they had a list of grievances, and we tried to go through them and tick them off and see how we could resolve them. We resolved some, we didn't resolve all of them, but in the end, Vladimir Putin, when he came back in 2012, after the large-scale protests that had occurred in Russia surrounding both his re-election and then the parliamentary elections afterwards, had changed, and he clearly was moving towards a sense that we could not have a relationship with NATO, that NATO was the enemy, that NATO was imposing its own desires on countries where Russia thought it needed to have its say, what it calls it near abroad, and we've seen the consequences since 2014, when the war against Ukraine really started. This war's now been going on for over 10 years. We've been living with the consequences.
When Donald Trump effectively invited Putin to do whatever he liked to alliance members who didn't pay up, as he put it, in other words, not spending 2% of GDP on defence, how much damage do you think it did to NATO? And what kind of opportunities do you think that kind of comment presented to Putin?
I think it did extraordinary damage. I was at the Munich Security Conference, which each year sort of call it the Academy Awards for Global National Security wonks in Munich. Shortly after Donald Trump had made those remarks, and at the same time, it was also a time where Navalny was found dead in his prison, and the Russians had taken a critical town in the Donetsk area. And the mood among Europeans, among allies, was that they were squeezed between Trump and Putin. Trump, that is a country that, in the United States, should he come back as president, could no longer be relied on as it had been since 1941, when you think about it, as a country that cared about European security, and Putin, because he was willing to do whatever it takes for him not only to stay in power and eliminate his opposition, but also to extend Russia's territorial and ideological ambitions as far beyond its borders as it possibly could. So it did great damage, and it has raised fundamental questions among Europeans, both at official levels and I'd say even more among publics, about, can we trust the United States? Will the United States be there when it matters? And alliances are based on trust. They're not based just on capabilities. They're certainly not based on dollars and cents. They're based on the idea that if I do my part, that others will be there when it matters. I mean, Estonia and other countries sent most of their military to Afghanistan, not because they thought there was a threat from Afghanistan, but because they wanted to be good allies. And they did that because they want the United States to be a good ally in return. And that is what Donald Trump, in making these really outrageous statements that suggest that our commitment to security in countries depends on how many dollars and cents they spend, is calling into question. That in the 75th anniversary year of NATO.
What do you think is the greatest threat to NATO, to the alliance? Is it Putin or Donald Trump if he ever becomes president?
Well, it's Putin, because he has aggressive ambitions to divide NATO so that he can extend his influence and control further beyond his borders, not just Ukraine, not just Belarus, but the Baltic states, Poland, who knows where it will end. So it is that drive, this aggressive imperialist drive that is at the core now of Russia's foreign policy, that is the threat. The problem is that Donald Trump is undermining the best instrument we have for dealing with that threat, and in fact making sure that it doesn't doesn't come about, because he's undermining the one thing that the United States and its allies have that the Russians, and by the way, the Chinese don't have, and that is a faith in alliances. The idea that alliances make us more secure, not because they are paying us, not because they are spending money on defense, but because we have common interests to come together and defend those interests together. So ultimately, without Putin, you don't worry as much about the strength and unity of NATO. But given that we have Putin, Donald Trump's questioning of alliances writ large, not just in Europe, but also in East Asia, is undermining American security, American prosperity, and ultimately American freedom. And that is what, in some ways, this election is about, but also what this debate is about how to think about our engagement and continued engagement in the world.
The NATO 75th anniversary summit is fast approaching. It's next month in Washington. If you were US ambassador to NATO right now, what would you be saying and doing, and what would your priorities be at that summit?
Well, we have a terrific ambassador at NATO in Julian Smith. So I know that she's doing everything that she can possibly do to strengthen the alliance. I think there really are two things that we need to focus on. One is to continue the implementation of strengthening deterrence and defense capabilities of a now enlarged NATO that includes Finland and Sweden, to make sure that NATO will always be there to defend every inch of NATO territory against the aggression, both military and in terms of hybrid capabilities that the Russians continue to focus on NATO and NATO territory. That's number one. I'm very confident that we will continue to do that. The spending is going up because Europeans understand there is a real threat. It's not because the United States tells them to. It's because they actually think it's important for their own security to do it. Thank you, Mr. Putin, is the one thing that you can thank him for. And the second thing is really to make sure that there is a complete and utter unity on the question that Ukraine cannot fail. That Russia cannot succeed in Ukraine, that we do whatever it is that we need to do in order to ensure that Ukraine succeeds. Success doesn't necessarily mean the reconquering of every inch of Ukrainian territory that the Russians have occupied either since 2022 or indeed since 2014. That's really for the Ukrainians to decide. But it is to make sure that Ukraine succeeds as a state in which it can determine its own future, including its future to be a member of NATO and the European Union, should it so desire, and should the allies agree, as I think they should and will, but also to be able to control their destiny in without fear or favor to an aggressive neighbor, and that defeat of Russia, which is already very costly, 500,000 casualties, according to the British MOD on the Russian side. To that defeat is important because without that defeat, our security will be less than it is today.
The next Secretary General is expected to be confirmed in Washington next month. Your fellow countryman, Mark Rutte, what will he bring to NATO and to Ukraine?
Well, he's the most senior European statesperson around. He's been in power for 13 years. He is an extraordinary consensus builder. You have to be in order to be in Dutch politics, certainly to be as successful as he has been. Four different coalitions, 4 different governments, with a wide variety of political parties. He's well known within the European Union as a consensus builder, as someone who brings coalitions together. And that is the core of what a NATO Secretary General does. A NATO Secretary General is far less general and far more secretary. That is to say, the person has no vote. All it has is the power of persuasion and the leadership that comes with the power of persuasion. And Mark Rutte is singularly capable of doing that and has demonstrated in the EU he will do it. Having the most senior European statesman to be the Secretary General of NATO, particularly someone who is a genuinely nice person and willing to work with anyone at any time, is particularly useful at this time. So they're still dotting the I's and crossing the T's on the consensus. There's still some issues to be overcome, but I expect that NATO will in October have a new Secretary General, and it will be Mark Rutte, and I think the alliance will be the better for it.
Ivo Dolder, a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.